Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another edition to Draco Sinister. So I do have a little bit of a disclaimer. This chapter has a trigger warning for child abuse. So if that is not something that you are comfortable with, it might be a good idea to sit this chapter out. But other than that, let us just get into it. Chapter 6 Fortunate Sons. Are you sure about this? Asked the wizard guard, looking anxiously at the boy in front of him. His face was familiar from pictures in the Daily Prophet, and of course the resemblance was there as well, but the pictures hadn't shown such a cold, set expression. If you don't mind my saying, you don't look all that well. I'm perfectly fine, said the boy, in a ringingly superior tone of someone used to getting his own way. I'm authorized, is that correct? Well, of course you are, but... And you'll be watching? Yes? Then let me in. All right, said the guard, and took out his wand. The lock on the heavy iron door was less a lock than a series of magical wards that required a sequence of spells to remove it. The process took several moments, during which the boy stood glaring at him, pale and impatient looking. Are you done yet? He demanded. Yes, said the guard, and pushed the door open. The boy went through without looking at him, and the door shut. As it did, it became transparent, so that the guard could watch what transpired in the room, although its occupants could not see out. It took Draco's eyes several moments to adjust to the half-light inside the cell. There were no windows, nor were there any lamps. What little light there was seemed to come from the walls, dimly blue and phosphorescent. By its glow, he made out a shape of the small square room, the mattress on the floor, and a low table set against a wall. A man sat at the table, holding a book in his lap. He raised his head when the door opened, and his eyes fell on Draco with a cold and calculating look that lacked surprise. Draco felt his hands knot together tightly under his cloak. Hello, father, he said. Lucius Malfoy slowly lowered the book he was holding, although he did not stand up to greet his son. He looked much the same. Even in prison, Lucius retained most of his sharp dignity. He was neat and trim in starched-looking gray robes. Draco, said his father, inclining his head. I knew you'd come eventually. I left instructions that they were to allow you in when you came. The Malfoy name still counts for something, despite all you and your mother have done to destroy it. So you bribed them, said Draco. Typical. Lucius tilted his head to the side, his eyes still fixed on his son. Draco saw that his thin, long-fingered hands were locked tightly together across his lap. I had forgotten how amusing you find yourself, he said. Is that why you came here? To impress me with your wit? No, said Draco flatly. I was just hoping we could continue our great familiar tradition of gut-wrenching misery and verbal abuse. Tell me, would it kill you just this once to say, Hello, son. What did you want to talk to me about? Lucius leaned back and crossed his arms over his chest. He kicked out sharply with his left foot, catching the chair opposite him with one booted toe, and sent it spinning across the room towards Draco, who had to jump back to avoid being hit by it. Sit, he said. Slowly, Draco reached down and yanked the chair upright from the floor where it had fallen, and sat down, keeping a wary eye on his father. Anyone looking at the two of them would have been startled, first by the resemblance, and secondly by the hostility that crackled between them like an electrical charge. "So, son," said Lucius Malfoy, "what did you want to talk to me about? Did you want to ask me how I'm enjoying myself in here? The congenial company, the excellent food, the kindly treatment?" "No," said Draco. "I wanted to ask you something about our family." Lucius raised an eyebrow. "You told Harry there was madness in our family," said Draco. "I wanted to know what kind of madness. How far back does it go?" Lucius's eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise that quickly smoothed itself out into indifference. "You think you're going mad?" "I'm not sure." Lucius looked at his son, and for a moment saw the pale, familiar face stripped of its defenses, saw the pain and the panic behind the eyes. "I've been having dreams," Draco began. "Not my own dreams. Somebody else's. There are battles, a lot of blood and killing, a banner with a dragon on it." "Facing left," said Lucius. "A silver dragon on a black background." Draco blinked at him. "You know whose dreams they are?" Lucius examined his fingernails. "Don't you?" he said in a bored tone. "You know, it would be nice if you started telling me the truth for once in your life," snapped Draco, "instead of giving me annoying riddles all the time." Lucius smiled. "Do you want the truth? All right. Let me tell you something, boy. When a man joins the Death Eaters, he gives himself to the Dark Lord. To be accepted into his circle, you must offer up one thing that is purely yours. It might be a specific memory, or a gift with languages, a skill at sports. It is his choice. When I joined him, he asked me for you." Draco's eyes went wide with astonishment. "But I wasn't even born. You were 16. "No, you weren't born, but he knew you would be. The timing was perfect. The Dark Lord showed me how to perform certain dangerous and difficult spells and enchantments to ensure that you would be born in the image he had designed, with certain qualities: magic powers, viciousness and charm, lack of empathy, competitiveness, cruelty. You were to follow in his footsteps, and I—" "What happened?" Draco interrupted. "Did the spells not work?" "Oh, they worked," said Lucius. "But then the Dark Lord was defeated. You were not yet 1 year old, and there was no one to direct your growth, to continue the spells and the potions and the training. There was only me, and I did my best. But somehow you got away from me. You were meant for a purpose, but I didn't know what that purpose was. I'm afraid I have never known it. When the Dark Lord returned to power, he refused to tell me." Lucius shrugged. "He said I would learn in good time." Draco had gone very white and stared hard at his father. "Think of it as an alarm clock," Lucius said, leaning back in his chair. "Whatever you carry inside you has lain dormant until now. Until your magic powers began to work. Until you were nearly grown. Until you wielded the sword." "The sword," Draco echoed. "It is the key," said Lucius blandly. "The Dark Lord gave it to me when you were born. Of course, I couldn't touch it. he added, sounding slightly bitter. So I was never tempted. Does it give you visions? Nightmares, said Draco in a clenched sort of voice. Visions, said his father again. You see what you want, what you need, what was and what will be. It doesn't show me what I want, exclaimed Draco, revolted. It shows me horrible things. Lucius smiled. The first time you saw it, you wanted it, didn't you? He said. You took it from Harry. You kept it by you, and you resisted all efforts to deprive you of it. You take it wherever you go. You have it with you now. You cannot bear to be parted from it. It's your future, boy, and you can't walk away from it. I can, said Draco, but his hands were shaking. You can't, roared Lucius, suddenly starting up in his chair. You were made. Don't you understand that? You were built to fulfill a purpose. Even your name was chosen for you by the Dark Lord, the dragon. Draco sat very still, and without looking at his father, he said, And that was all right with you? Lucius said nothing, but settled back into his chair. Draco raised his head. Whatever else I am, I'm your son, of your blood. I look like you, and you traded me to the Dark Lord for a little bit of power? It would have been a great deal of power, corrected Lucius. Then he looked away. I never wanted a child. It was all part of the plan. Draco looked down at his hands. In my dreams, he said hoarsely, he tells me I have to kill Harry. Then kill Harry, said Lucius. It's what you were meant for. I can't, said Draco. Lucius's mouth tightened. You're weak, he said. That's partly my fault. Draco didn't respond. Without seeming to be aware of it, he stood up suddenly and backed up, away from his father, until he was standing against the wall. There's an intricate mechanism inside you, boy, Lucius said. The Dark Lord wound you up like clockwork and set you on this path. It could be a path to greatness. This could be your second chance, our second chance. How many men can say they were born to a purpose? What if I fight it? Draco demanded, his voice taking on a slightly wild tone. What then? What happens to a watch when you wind it backwards? Replied Lucius. Draco sucked in a gasp, as if he'd been punched in the stomach. It breaks, he responded, with as much dignity as he could muster. Lucius took no notice. Why would you want to fight it anyway? He demanded, still staring at his son. Are you trying to be good? No, said Draco quickly, and then, I don't know. You're a slave to what you think you want, like everyone else, Lucius replied sharply. You think I didn't see your face back at the manor when you looked at them, at her? Do you want to barter your destiny for the friendship of a boy who will never like you, and the favor of a girl who doesn't return your affection? To ally yourself with people who will never regard you with anything more than suspicion and mistrust? They are not our kind of people, and they never will be. You will never belong with them. As he spoke, Lucius watched the changing colors in his son's face. First white, then very red, then white again. He could tell Draco was struggling to hide whatever he was feeling, and from that alone, he knew he was hurting him. Which was as it should be. He was his son, his to help, or to hurt, as he saw fit. "Can't change what you are, Draco," he said, his voice soft and unyielding. "And they know that. Dumbledore, Sirius Black, even your new friend, Harry Potter. They know that there is something they have that you don't. Some essential fragment missing from your soul that makes you different. Call it morality or whatever you like, but you can't change it. You can wear the guise of goodness, but underneath it, you are what I made you to be." For a moment, Draco returned his father's gaze without moving. Then his eyes darkened, and in one fluid motion he reached up, took hold of the epicelical charm that hung around his neck, and, without a moment's hesitation, drew it over his head and threw it at his father. Reflexively, Lucius Malfoy reached up and caught the bright circular object out of the air and stared at it. "For you, father," said Draco. "Go ahead. Break it. Crush it. I'll be dead before the guard can get into the room." Lucius didn't move, just stared at his son, who stared back out of blazing eyes. "What are you afraid of?" Draco hissed. "You're already in here for life. They'll never let you out, and I'd rather be dead than be a slave to your creation. Go on, do it." "No," said Lucius, closing his hand gently around the charm. "I don't want you dead, boy," he said with a slight smile. "I want the satisfaction of knowing that you are alive and that you suffer. Knowing what you have done to destroy our family and how you have condemned me to rot in this hell. I hope it eats you alive. Now get out of here. I'm sick of the sight of you." Draco turned and rapped hard on the cell door. He stood for a moment waiting, his back to his father. As the wards on the other side of the door began to unlock, he turned back around and looked at Lucius. "This isn't hell, father," he said. "When you get to hell, I think you'll find there will be a lot more of our kind of people there." The door opened, and Draco went through it. Ginny was staring mutely at the empty sky into which Draco had disappeared. She half hoped that if she waited there long enough he might come back, gliding down on his broomstick, looking tall and pale and irritable, but perhaps open to be reasoned with. As she continued to stare, she heard Harry and Ron burst out of the shrubbery and into the clearing. Both boys were out of breath and covered in leaves and twigs. Ron spoke first. "Ginny, are you all right?" "I'm fine," said Ginny, turning to look at them. "I'm fine." She saw the look of panic on Harry's face replaced quickly by relief, which was replaced by something else, a blank sort of look. "Where's Malfoy?" asked Ron. "He's gone," said Ginny in a thin voice. "He flew off." Ron swore and kicked the trunk of a tree. Harry shook his head. "I can't believe he just left," he said. "Who cares?" said Ron, looking exasperated. "He's been itching to bugger off all day, probably trying to get out of having any real responsibility." "Ron, shut up, will you?" exclaimed Harry suddenly, and looked at Ginny. "The charm. We can use it to find him." Ginny shook her head. "He took it with him." "He took it?" echoed Ron in disbelief. "Why?" "I think it's pretty obvious why he took it," Harry replied, sounding weary. "He doesn't want us to be able to find him." Ginny felt her heart contract. "But we have to find him," she said in a wavering voice. "He's in trouble." "I think you're mixing up being in trouble with just being trouble," said Ron. Harry looked despairing. "We better go talk to Sirius." But by the time they arrived at the library, Sirius and Lupin were gone, and Narcissa was sitting behind the desk looking terribly strained and worried. She explained to them what had happened to Dumbledore and Fudge on their way to the manor. The official notice from the Ministry had said only that Dementors were suspected in the attack. Fudge was dead, and Dumbledore was in serious condition. The Ministry had indicated that before lapsing into unconsciousness, Dumbledore had requested Sirius's presence. "They've apparated themselves to St. Mungo's," said Narcissa, looking as if she were trying to hide how unhappy she felt. "They went by Floo powder to St. Mungo's," said Narcissa, looking as if she were trying to hide how unhappy she felt. Her eyes darted from Harry's face to Ginny's. "Where's Draco?" There was a short silence. Then Harry said, "He's gone. I'm really sorry. We tried to..." He broke off and looked down, hiding his expression, but Ginny felt how miserable he was. "I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry," he said again. Narcissa bit her lip. She was very pale. "I'd better make sure to let Sirius know," she said, rising to her feet and hurrying over to the fireplace. She took a handful of powder out of her pocket and tossed it into the flames, which glowed briefly purple. Ginny heard her say, "St. Mungo's Hospital, please." "Do you think Draco's going to be all right?" asked Ginny vaguely. Harry glanced at her and tried a smile, which failed. "I don't know, Ginny, but I do know that Sirius is going to be really hacked off." Ginny opened her mouth to reply, but Harry's eyes darted sideways, and she turned to see a slight shimmer in the air as Anton, one of the Malfoy family ghosts, walked calmly through the north wall. He glided gently into the room, becoming more solid and less transparent as he did so, and paused near Narcissa.
"Madam," he said, "there are guests downstairs."
Narcissa turned away from the fire and regarded him with startled eyes. "Who is it?" Anton cleared his transparent throat and said,
"Molly and Arthur Weasley."
Ron and Ginny looked at each other in horror.
"Mum and Dad," groaned Ron. "I forgot they were coming."
Charlie Weasley had just finished forwarding the letter written to him by Severus Snape when a strange feeling of unease overtook him. At first, he suspected it was due to what he had read earlier, as the letter itself had been brief, but certain. This was something else, though. Something he knew would not let him rest until he had sorted it out. He swore softly as he grabbed up his wand from the table next to his bed and, murmuring, "Lumos," ducked out of his tent. Charlie walked through the camp, which was silent, as most of his compatriots had taken off in various directions to trail sightings of dragons, past the last of the tents, and out to the dragon pen. Usually, dragons slept standing up, with their eyes closed and heads leaned together. At this hour, they should have been dozing, but instead, 8 or so dragons stood awake in the center of the pen. Charlie's heart contracted as he moved as close as he could to the wall of magical wards that enclosed the pen, and stared. There was someone inside the dragon pen. Whoever that person was, they were either incredibly brave or else very stupid. It was against the rules of dragon wrangling, as well as all common sense, for anyone to enter the dragon pen alone and unprotected. Dragons were untamable, vicious, and given the opportunity, would happily attack even the wizards that fed them. Mouth dry, Charlie began frantically muttering the incantations that would create an opening in the wards large enough for him to walk through. Alohomora, Parilia, Transi. The opening gaped before him, and he walked through it and stared around him. Whispering a protective incantation, Charlie began edging slowly towards the center of the pen, moving as calmly as anxiety and stark terror allowed. He could see the intruder more distinctly now, could see a clearer outline of arms and legs and pale silver blonde hair. Draco. Charlie clapped a hand over his mouth to keep himself from shouting out his name. What the hell is he doing? Trying to get himself killed? Despite his astonishment, his feet kept moving, carrying him closer to the center of the enclosure and closer to Draco. He was standing very still in the middle of the circle of dragons, who rose above him like breathing statues, their scales streaming starlight. His hands were nestled inside the pockets of his trousers, his head tilted back, gazing up at the enormous creatures that towered above him, as if they were nothing more than extremely tall and extremely interesting rock formations. Charlie sucked in his breath as he edged over to Draco and reached out and put a hand on his shoulder, willing the boy not to cry out in surprise. He didn't. Neither did he jump or look startled either, only turned and looked at Charlie with wide, incurious eyes. "Hello, Charlie," he said in perfectly normal tones. "Hello yourself," Charlie croaked as he reached forward and seized hold of Draco's arm. Using the muscles that came from toting heavy equipment all day, he commenced dragging him backwards. To his surprise, Draco put up very little resistance as he hauled him away from the dragons, who watched with what looked like detached interest. They reached the gap in the wards, and Charlie ducked through it, pulling Draco behind him by the arm. Once they were through, he let go his grip on the boy and shoved him as hard as he could against the nearest tree. The back of Draco's head hit the tree trunk with a force that looked like it must have hurt, but he didn't change expression, just put up his left hand and rubbed at his neck. "What the hell are you doing back here, Draco?" Charlie began angrily. "More to the point, what the hell were you doing?" "I wanted to see the dragons," said Draco, unfazed. "You wanted to see the dragons? Merlin's beard. Can't you come up with anything better than that? If you wanted to look at the dragons, why didn't you stand outside the bloody walls and look at them?" "They wouldn't have hurt me," said Draco, still weirdly calm. Then he grinned. "Don't know about you, though." "They wouldn't have hurt you. You're just a walking lunchbox to them, you stupid kid." Draco gave him an angelic smile. "Did they look like they were going to hurt me?" Charlie stared at Draco, and a thought struck him. Something was off. He looked different somehow. Physically, he was the same, of course. But there was something that burned through his skin like lamplight through a shade. The air around him seemed to crackle with suppressed electricity. Said Charlie, feeling even more worried now. "Draco, are you feeling all right?" Draco's smile didn't fade. "I feel..." he began, taking his hands out of his pockets and looking at them as if they were alien objects. "I feel like I could do anything. Anything at all. Why? Do I look different?" "No," said Charlie decidedly. "You look done in. When was the last time you got any sleep?" "Sleep?" said Draco, and now there was a faint note of alarm in his voice. "Like proper sleep? Oh, I haven't done that in 2 weeks, maybe?" Charlie sighed. "What you need, my boy, is some rest. You could have the couch in my tent. I'll give you some blankets, and we'll owl serious—" "No!" interrupted Draco sharply, his smile gone now. "No what?" "No, I don't need to sleep on your couch. Sleep is the last thing I need. One more will finish me off." Charlie blinked in confusion. "One more what?" "One more dream. You wouldn't understand," he said, and began walking away from the enclosure, towards the trees. "Look here," said Charlie, reaching out and grabbing hold of Draco's sleeve and turning him around so they were face to face. "Did you drink a potion by mistake? What kind was it? Blue, red, or green? Or did you take one of the whirly black kind? George took one of those once and spent a week thinking he was a motorbike. I don't think I'm a motorbike, whatever that is, said Draco irritably. Look, would you just let go of my jacket? I'm perfectly fine. You're not fine, said Charlie, although he let go of Draco's arm. You just nearly got yourself killed. Now stop being a complete prat and come back to the tent and get some sleep. You don't look good. But I feel good, Draco insisted, opening up his silvery eyes very wide. I feel great. He broke off and looked at Charlie intently. What would you say if someone offered you powers that would allow you to rule the whole wizarding world? I'd say that ruling the world isn't all it's cracked up to be, said Charlie gently. Long hours, waving at people all the time, never your own boss, and now with the mockery. I'm not mocking you, said Charlie, trying his damnedest not to become irate. I'm worried about you. Trying to feed yourself to dragons? Asking me crazy questions? I know you've been through a lot lately, but you don't know. Draco interrupted. Hell, even I don't know. I can't believe I'm even confused about this. What's there to be confused about? On the one hand, sudden death. On the other hand, power and eternal life, and all my wishes granted. I could be young and handsome forever. Not everyone can say that. He looked up at Charlie and shook his head. I hate Harry. This is all his fault. What the bleeding hell does any of this have to do with Harry? Said Charlie in exasperation, and decided right then and there that he was going to force Draco to bed, whether he liked it or not. He reached out and grabbed at Draco's wrist, meaning to drag him all the way to the tent, and sucked in his breath in surprise. The wrist that he held was colder than any skin a living person had any right to have. He pulled his hand away, stunned. Draco looked at him, and his eyes showed anxiety, but no surprise. Did I hurt you? You're freezing cold, said Charlie, like ice. Are you ill? It's happening fast, said Draco, isn't it? Charlie just stared at him. I should go, said Draco. Don't tell anyone I was here. Draco, said Charlie, trying to sound patient. I can't do that. You nearly got yourself killed tonight. Do you realize that? Don't force me to make you forget you ever saw me, Draco said, the moonlight sparking cold light from his eyes. Charlie blinked. You know I can do it, said Draco, retrieving his firebolt from the ground where he had dropped it earlier. Promise me you won't tell anyone I was here. Charlie cleared his throat, feeling suddenly both bewildered and uneasy. What makes you think I'd keep a promise like that? You're a Weasley, said Draco, hoisting his firebolt. Loyal to a fault. All right, said Charlie. I'll promise. On one condition. What? Let me get you some food and a change of clothes, at least. Draco looked at him blankly for a moment before nodding. Charlie took off, jogging towards his tent, his mind racing even faster than his feet. Something very odd is going on, he thought, as he threw together a quick bundle of food and some clothes, which included a pile of sweaters. The boy was obviously freezing. It's June, said a voice in the back of his head. Why is he so cold? He was half positive that Draco would be gone by the time he got back, but he was still there. A quiet and oddly forlorn huddle of dark clothing and pale hair sitting at the base of the tree, holding his firebolt across his lap as if it were a weapon. Charlie stopped dead and stared at him. Draco, he said, I know she's not awake, but would you like to see Hermione? At this, Draco looked up, his eyes suddenly opaque and glossy. No, he said, standing up and flashing Charlie a smile that would give him nightmares for several years. She'll come back to me one way or another. Now is not the time to see her. Not yet. And with that nonsensical statement, he reached out and took the bundle of clothes and food out of Charlie's unresisting hands. "Be careful," said Charlie, realizing how inadequate this sounded. "Come back if you need—" "Thanks, Charlie," Draco interrupted, got in his firebolt, and took off. Charlie was both sorry and not sorry to see him go. Lupin followed Sirius down the crowded hallway at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. As they approached the room where they had been told Dumbledore was, they saw a crowd of people gathered there. Reporters. Lupin recognized the banana-yellow robes and glittering spectacles of Rita Skeeter. Doctors and half-hysterical ministry bureaucrats milling about like ants. The pair of them pushed their way through the knot of people, only to be stopped at the door by a white-coated meta-wizard wearing glasses and a harassed expression. He threw out an arm to block their progress. "This area's off limits." Sirius crossed his arms over his chest and glared. "And you are?" The meta-wizard looked insulted. "I'm Dr. Simon Branford. I'm in charge of this floor, and this room is off limits to everyone except—" "Sirius Black," interrupted Sirius. "I was sent for by the Ministry." "You're Sirius Black?" The meta-wizard lowered his arm, looking sideways at Sirius, who found it astonishing that the man would even hesitate. There had been a time when his face had been familiar to the entire wizarding community, but of course he looked very different now. "You better come in," he said. "We've been expecting you." Sirius was about to say something rude when Lupin interceded hastily. "Thank you," he said to the doctor, who nodded in acknowledgement and quickly pushed the door open, gesturing Sirius in ahead of him. Dr. Branford ducked after him, and Lupin followed. They found themselves in a narrow hallway with a single door leading off it. "There are two things I need to tell you," said the doctor, turning to face Lupin and Sirius. "One is that your wife sent a message to our administrator for me to give to you." He looked doubtfully at Sirius, who didn't bother to correct him in regards to Narcissa, and just raised an eyebrow. "She said that Draco is gone and they don't know where to find him. I assume that means something to you?" "Yes," said Sirius a little shortly, and exchanged a quick glance with Lupin. "That means something to me." "Second thing," continued the meta-wizard, "is that Professor Dumbledore is in a state of what we call magical stasis. Only a very limited amount of pre-approved magic can be performed in his presence. Please keep your wands in your pockets. Understood?" The two men nodded their acquiescence and followed Dr. Branford through the single door, which a mid-sized hospital room with white scrubbed stone walls lay behind. The centerpiece of the room was a large bed on which lay Albus Dumbledore, a white coverlet pulled up to his chest, his eyes shut. Lupin's heart contracted to see how old and helpless he looked. Sirius went to stand by the side of the bed, his hands knotted together, his face expressionless. Lupin approached the center of the room, the nerves along his spine prickling. The aura of dark magic, faint but palpable, hung over the bed and the frail-looking man who lay there. He glanced over at the doctor. "Is he going to die?" "We don't know," the doctor replied, looking very unhappy. "With stasis, one can never really say for sure if death is imminent. His vital signs are steady, but he can't be woken, nor does he respond to stimuli." "What happened to him?" interrupted Sirius, not taking his eyes off Dumbledore. "The letter said Dementors, but Dumbledore could have handled Dementors. Was there something else?" "A very astute observation, Black," came a sarcastic voice from the door. Lupin and Sirius turned and stared, Lupin with astonishment, and Sirius with horror. It was Severus Snape. He hadn't changed since the last time Lupin had seen him, 3 years ago now, in the Shrieking Shack in Hogsmeade. The same sallow face, dominated by hooded eyes and a sour expression. He wore starched black robes, the left arm of which was bound with the green band that marked him as the head of Slytherin House. His right arm was banded with yellow, that meant he was on ministry business. "Professor Snape," said the meta wizard, sounding relieved. Snape stalked past them all without glancing their way, and sat himself in one of the chairs next to Dumbledore's bedside. He began removing items from the pockets of his robes. Lupin glimpsed a mortar and pestle, a bag of what might have been beetle shells, and some kind of flask. Sirius immediately sat himself down in another of the chairs and glared at the potions master. "What are you doing here, Snape?" Snape looked at Sirius with smooth malice. "Ministry business, obviously. I think the real question is, what are you doing here?" "The Ministry sent for me too," snapped Sirius. "Dumbledore and Fudge were on the way to see me when they were attacked. I believe they thought I could shed some light on the situation." Snape glanced up at the doctor, who nodded. "Perhaps nobody told you," he began silkily, fiddling with his mortar and pedestal in a way that Lupin couldn't quite make out, his gestures being hidden by the voluminous sleeves of his robes, "that Dumbledore told the Ministry last year that if anything untoward were to happen to him, I should be in charge of the investigation. He gave me detailed instructions, which I am following." He gave them a thin smile. "I trust you are not planning to challenge his authority in this matter?" "What happened to Fudge and Dumbledore?" asked Lupin, trying to keep the suspicion and hostility out of his voice. "We heard
Fudge is dead. You know that, of course. They're in the process of choosing a new minister as we speak. And it wasn't Dementors," Snape added, his mouth curving violently downward. "It looks to have been the work of a powerful dark wizard. One more powerful than even he who must not be named."
"So, who was it?" Sirius snapped. Lupin could see by the slight nervous tick at the edge of his eye that always appeared when he was very annoyed, that Sirius was forcibly restraining himself from lunging across the bed and physically beating the answers out of Snape.
"We don't know," said Snape succinctly. "That's what I'm here to find out."
"Find out from whom?"
"From Dumbledore," said Snape quietly.
"But he's in stasis!" Sirius swept a hand towards Dumbledore's prone form. "Not responsive." Snape gave Sirius a hooded glare.
"Perhaps if you hadn't always been skeeving off in potions class," he said coldly, "you'd have a better idea why I'm here."
Sirius's left eye twitched again, more violently this time. "Useless, smug git!" he exploded.
"I prefer that you dispense with the name-calling," said Snape dangerously. "It serves no purpose."
"And I prefer that you choke to death on a garden gnome, but we don't always get what we want, do we?" said Sirius, ignoring Lupin's quelling glances. "Sirius, now's not the time," he said quietly. "Oh, shut up, Moony," snapped Sirius, narrowing his eyes in exasperation.
"Moony?" Snape's eyebrows shot up. "You two still call each other by your childhood pet names? How adorable. In a sad Arrested Development sort of way."
Lupin stepped quickly to Sirius's side and put his hand firmly on his friend's shoulder. This was partly to show his support, and partly to remind Sirius that, if necessary, he could hold him down and forcibly prevent him from jumping on Snape. In 5th year at school, Lupin had once thrown Sirius across the Gryffindor common room. It was easy, even for his friends, to forget how strong he actually was. "Professor Snape," said Lupin calmly, "we're all here for the same reason. Let's try to keep this from getting personal." Snape ignored him, As he finished doing whatever he had been doing with his mortar and pedestal, he turned around now, holding in one hand a flask half full of liquid, and in another a small clear bag of blackish powder. He proceeded to pour the powder into the liquid, shook the flask several times, and rolled his voluminous sleeves back before bending over Dumbledore, holding the flask. Leaning forward, he put a hand on Dumbledore's shoulder, a curiously gentle gesture, Lupin thought, then proceeded to pour the contents of the flask into Dumbledore's unresponsive mouth. Sirius's shoulders jerked under Lupin's grip. "What are you doing?" Snape sat back, clutching the now empty flask and staring at Dumbledore's limp form with wide, glittering eyes. "Just wait." Lupin stared. For a moment there was nothing. Then he saw the tension in Snape's shoulders suddenly sharpen, and heard Sirius at his side give a little gasp of astonishment. Dumbledore's body was moving, his hands tightening into fists, his back arcing up. A gray plume of smoke suddenly burst from his chest and rose upwards, trailing threads of silvery dust. Instead of dissipating, the smoke began to coalesce and harden. It began to sculpt itself into a shape. Lupin saw eyes forming, a nose, a mouth, a stream of silvery hair, a pair of half-transparent spectacles. The ghostly form of Dumbledore's head and shoulders suddenly appeared. It rotated slightly to face them, and Lupin, speechless with astonishment, saw the half-transparent mouth smile.
"Severus,"
said Dumbledore, looking down at him.
"Sirius, and Remus, you're all here."
Snape glanced sideways at Sirius and Lupin's perplexed expressions, and a faint smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "We're here, Headmaster, but we haven't got much time." Dumbledore inclined his head.
"Then let us begin."
There was just enough illumination in the cell for Lucius Malfoy to see the circle he had drawn on the floor in his own blood. Left wandless in this senseless place, he had to bite one of his veins open to get what he needed. But it was far from the worst thing he had ever been forced to do. Moving carefully, he sat down in the center of the circle, then held his hands out before him. In his left hand, his son's epicelical charm glittered gold in the faint light. "Vocatio," he whispered and paused. "Master, I have something for you." And that is the end of this chapter. Thank you guys so much for joining me. So as always, if you are enjoying this content, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you are feeling wanderlusty, please be sure to check out my Patreon. It is linked in my About section here on YouTube. I have my own personal writings there and spicy fan art for my patrons and higher tiers. So if you guys could do that for me, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. And I will see you all in the next one. Good night.